What if we get... Ooh, interesting. The official Muslim American is on. We kind of going the other way with that. All right, let's see if he's on here. Hey, Steph. I want to see... Brad was just here. I'll just keep checking on him here. I think he knows. Wow, hey guys. There's a lot of people in here. Hang tight. I'm going to be getting Brad on the line. For those of you that didn't hear, he is, I believe, Messianic Jewish. He's, I almost said a Torah scholar. That's probably a little strongly worded, but we're going to get it from him what he is. And I have some questions, kind of some hard-hitting questions about being a Christian. And, we have a very American-centric idea of Yeshua, Yahusha, Jesus, Joshua, Iesu, whatever exactly the name is. We're going to cover that too. So I got a lot of questions, and I would like you guys to throw in some questions too. Hey, dude, what if then, Mr. Then? Okay, guys, I'm gonna see if he's on here. There he is. Here we go. I'm gonna invite him in, you guys. Mr. Brad.
What's up, my man?
How are you, sir? Officially, I'm Luke. Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you, Luke.
Yeah, you can call me Nuke, Guy, whatever. Doesn't matter. Voice. I'm excited to have you on here, man. I was just telling everybody about you and why I was hoping to get you on. If you remember, right when my wife convinced me to get on TikTok, you were basically one of the first creators that I followed, and I reached out to you immediately. And I remember telling you that, I grew up watching Zola Levitt and J.R. Church and those guys. And so my mother was Jewish, so she was half Irish, half Russian Jewish. She was raised Catholic from the Irish side, and I didn't even really know that she was Jewish until later. And so when I started I became a believer. The first church I saw was Catholicism. I went to a Catholic service. And I was like, no, man, whatever this is, no. And then
right.
Bounced around a little bit. Like I ended up at a Pentecostal church, and I was like, no. And basically, I'm anti-establishment enough that I was just like, I didn't feel that our Father, that God was particularly all over any of these churches. And so I started reading scripture, and, it was pretty evident to me. It was like, here are the rules. I grew up around some Seventh-day Adventists, so I understood about Sabbath. So that was like an immediate thing that I gravitated towards. And so, I just kind of went rogue a little bit there. And, one of the things I'm hoping to talk to you about today is kind of maybe guidance, because you hear about Torah observance or, you're covered by grace and whatever. So like, I'd like to talk a little about that. I got a ton of questions, so I'll stop talking. I'll ask you a question and we'll get going. And the first question is, how would you define what you believe? I don't want to put you in a box particularly, but Messianic Jewish, what are you?
So it's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm kind of in a middle ground between two camps that both reject me for one reason or another. Yes. So you could say Hebrew roots or Messianic, but there are even differences I have with those camps, as it were. For the Hebrew roots, they tend to be a little more opposed to the level with which I go into rabbinic literature. The Hebrew roots movement tends to kind of define themselves against the word of rabbinic Jews, and so that's one reason I don't fit into that camp. The best way that I could describe kind of the practice that I do is that it is a much more Orthodox Jewish practice, with the caveat that I do believe that Yeshua was the Messiah. Now, the Orthodox Jews would reject me on the grounds that I do that I do accept that Yeshua was the Messiah. So, like I said, I'm kind of in this weird place between two camps.
Well, and I'm no Jewish scholar, but my topical reading, my understanding of the story Genesis to Revelations, that seems to me like, I don't want to say the obvious, but look, nowhere does it say, scrap it, bail on the law, we're out, Jesus died for you, go have a party. And, it becomes tricky, right? Because if you're not Jewish, can you keep the law? Obviously, like atonement and like, it just, so that's one of the things I want to talk about is like what we do. But I love that you said that because, hey, to me, if they can't categorize you, you're probably closer to right, because by the fact that people define themselves as I'm this and you're wrong, everybody's a little bit wrong, right? Like that's why,
right, exactly.
That's why there's so many factions. So I think that's an awesome take.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been an interesting journey. There's definitely been points in my journey where I have leaned more Hebrew roots or Messianic. So there's, a lot of the people that I see on TikTok where we do have some disagreement, even if they are Torah practicing. For a lot of them, it's like, well, I remember when I thought the way that you do.
Yeah. So, okay. Hopefully, I say stupid things, so forgive me in advance. But it's a very difficult thing for a practicing Jewish person to accept Messiah because of how staunchly opposed or adherently against the idea of JC, of Jesus. I've studied a ton of this, and I get it. Like, if the idea is you don't want any false gods, great. But then there's also like all this propaganda and like, misinformation related, like passed down. And I know a lot of Messianic Jewish people who like, wow, Jesus, Yeshua is Messiah, and then their family disowns him. So like, it's hard to go from Jewish to Christian. So can I ask you what came first for you? How that happened?
So for me, I actually grew up in a Baptist church, more or less. So I grew up Christian, and the church that I grew up in was more of an independent fundamental type Baptist, so much more strict, much more legalistic in terms of unbiblical regulations, or maybe not unbiblical, maybe just extra biblical. I don't know if I would say unbiblical, but my father was a more well-respected Sunday school teacher in the church. He was one of the more well-respected men, just for his understanding of the Bible, to the point where actually even some of the kids in the youth group, if they wanted to know something about the Bible, they'd ask my dad before asking the pastor. That became a point of contention actually between the pastor and my dad. So my dad is the one who really kind of guided the family down this path. As a Sunday school teacher, he came to a point where year in and year out, you teach basically the same lessons. Maybe they have a different mask on, or maybe they're built up in a different way, but it's essentially the same lessons. It's kind of like if you spend a year or two in a Christian church, you're basically going to hear all the same sermons over and over again. They'll be built up a little bit different, but it's essentially the same sermon. And he realized that's a dangerous place to be, because you should never be at a point where you know everything there is to know, So he prayed and asked God to show him something new, and he let his Bible fall open, and it fell open to Matthew 5:17. And it just hit a little different that time.
Wow. That's of all of the verses, because if it was Old Testament, he may have bailed on it a little bit or not taken it seriously, but for it to be a New Testament reference to this, and he maybe had glossed over it, because like, I don't want to get into like disparaging religion, but I consider myself a religious in that, as a conspiracy theorist, I think that there's controlling men who get in every like medical, banking, religion, all these different places, and then they control for their good. And then from then the rules, like you said, the extra biblical mandates or whatever, now they're setting up a doctrine and a dogma that is it's got all these backdoors and protection.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I go into a bit of conspiracy theory myself. My parents kind of went down that path, and they both found themselves going there at the same time, but independently. So my mom is an herbalist. Okay, she believes in natural remedies, and so in her studies of kind of where the pharmaceutical companies have had their hands in the government pockets and whatnot, and the names involved, and each of the families involved in suppressing natural medicine. So she was reading that book, while separately my father was reading, I believe it's called "To Eliminate the Opiate." There's a Jewish rabbi who has a theory that there is a conspiracy to eliminate the Torah and the Jewish people. And the family names involved that he gives are all the same names that my mom found in her book regarding the pharmaceutical companies. And so that's kind of what got them going down the rabbit hole. And it just seems like every other subject, it's like, wow, it's these same family names.
Yep, it is. Can I ask you, without diverging into a conspiracy talk, although if we do more of these, that's more my area of specialty, but is Rothschild, is Meyer Rothschild one of the names or no?
Oh, for sure.
And you understand how many anti-Semitic, how many Jewish conspiracies are around a guy who was Jewish by birth, but 100% not Jewish, but by the fact he was born Jewish, they pin all these. I mean, and that's the Protocols book. I mean, we've seen that before, like, blame it on the Jews. And go ahead.
I try and tell people when they come at it like that, when you try and tie the whole of religious Judaism in with what I would call Frankist Jews, the more occultic minded, and Judaism is pretty fervent about trying to keep out those influences from within their ranks. But yeah, I try and tell people when you just bunch it all into one big ball of this one group that you're going to hate, you're doing exactly what they want you to do.
Of course, well, that's the point of the Protocols book, was to release the plans of the elite and show like how they control media and whatever else, but then pin it on the Jews. And it was so effective, it was taught in the schools in Russia and Germany right at the time that, the real World War II, the whole thing came up, and it was taught as fact, and it ended up later being a conspiracy. And it was the group doing what they were doing to control, but then pinning it on the Jewish people, and super effective. I mean, to me, one of the big telling things in the world that the Jewish people are gods, and why one of the reasons I'm very careful to not judge them is they're God's people, and, they deal with being blessed and being, disciplined, and the fact that they've had so much of an effect on the world, and the tragedy has been so tragic, and the heights have been so high. I mean, it goes back to the Abrahamic covenant to me, and people that don't see that, like, there's something supernatural about this group of people, that, I mean, it's just, to me, it's hard to argue.
Right. It's denying the power of God at the end.
It is.
It should be blatantly obvious at this point for us.
And then why over and over with multiple different, countries and governments is the end goal to stamp them out, to stamp out the Torah, to stamp out the people, to wipe out the bloodline of Messiah. They're like, if you're at all critical thinking and you can't see the bigger conspiracy that there's this multi-generational, multi-millennial, plan that always culminates in trying to wipe the Jews off the earth, well, the devil's probably real, ding-dongs. Like, if you miss that, how do you miss that point? If they're trying to kill God's people, like, it's easy.
Right. I had a friend that I used to work with him. We still work for the same company, but we work at different locations now. He is a secular Jew. But he still takes, pride in his heritage, and I've had him over for Passover before, and it was a great honor. I had a conversation with him once where, I asked him, I said, why do you think the Jews are so hated all over the world? Yes. Like, what do you think the reason is? Because he's an atheist, and so he said, well, probably because, we call people on their BS. It's just kind of in our nature to point it out. And I'm like, yeah, but what do you think gives the Jews that? Why do they know better than everybody else? Why do you think they know better than everybody else? It's just like the Jewish people are the biggest proof that God exists, that there is in the world.
Amen. And ironically, the Jewish people on one side of the coin, and then the Luciferians on the other. Not that I'm like believe in God because of the devil, but like there's a group of guys that like worship the devil, and there's like child sacrifice and all these unmentionable,
right,
like these terrible like anti-God things. And so like people, look, if you're atheist, and that's one of my big platforms here, like great. You had a bad religious experience. You think you figured it out. The science says you haven't figured it out. Your ignorance to just deny this thing that's going on is there's so much hubris. And one of the reasons like I try to reach them is like it's usually because their idea of God is solely they have a bad religious experience or whatever. But yeah, to deny it is, to me, it's a profoundly ignorant stance. But
right.
But that's a jerk thing for me to say. Okay, so you were raised in the Christian church, and then your dad kind of showed you this way, and then you started really researching. Because I would have been surprised had you been Jewish first, then Christian, because that's really tough to crack. But if you find the Jew that was raised Jew, and then maybe even turned secular Jew, and then Messiah, Saul of the road to Damascus kind of thing, they're very strong believers, very profound people. But so to have done this, so you started kind of going back, and it was one of my later questions, but like, just in case we get cut off or whatever, what do we do? no pressure, but like I'm observing Sabbath, and I didn't for years, and it was terrible, and God put in our heart, like, start there. Obviously, I try to follow the 10 Commandments. I think I do them for the most part, but like, there's a lot of laws. Like, can you give us, with all of your experience, can you give us like a overview of maybe like statement of intentions, any like best practices?
So it's interesting. And you're in very good company. Most people actually start with the Sabbath first, which is interesting because that's what the children of Israel started with. The first command God gave them was the Sabbath. It was like, look, if you can manage to keep this, then the rest of it should come. You should be able to do it. So the Sabbath is a first step for a lot of people, and it's most certainly one of the important steps. As far as after that, I mean, I would say most Christians who are if they're not Torah observant, they still live above their doctrine, and they are much more Torah observant than they would even realize. A lot of it is really just the Sabbath and then dietary law. Now, there's a little more minutia in both of those subjects. And this is another area where there would be some level of disagreement between me and other Messianics and like the Hebrew Roots movement, is they reject the idea of a Jewish oral tradition, or what the Jews call the oral Torah.
Yeah.
It's not that they reject that it exists. They reject that it was given by God to Moses, right? So they reject that it carries a similar weight to the written Torah. And I understand the reason.
Apocryphal, kind of.
What was that?
Almost like apocryphal teaching or non-canonical.
Well, yeah, sort of, not exactly. So it is called oral Torah for a reason. And it's understood to be kind of the details that are not given. So there are things in the Torah that we can observe that are there, but how you get there, there's no answer to. So the Torah acknowledges marriage, for sure. There are laws concerning, the things that a husband owes a wife, the duties of a wife, what have you, but there's no laws on how to get married. So how do you get married, right? There is such a thing as kosher slaughter. The Torah says, hey, God says, slaughter the animal in the way that I showed you, okay? But there is never at any point in the Torah a place where you'll see how to do that slaughter, like the method, it's never explained. And so these are things that are accepted as having been passed down orally from God to Moses, from Moses to the 70 elders, from the 70 elders to the rabbinate, what have you. And so it's within that where some of the minutia regarding Sabbath observance comes in. So a really popular tradition regarding Sabbath observance is to light a candle before the Sabbath begins, and then also after the Sabbath ends. And the reason for this is because you're not allowed to light a flame during the Sabbath, right? And so you light a candle prior to sundown on Friday night, and then another one after sundown on Saturday night to kind of bookend the Sabbath to really distinguish it from the other days of the week.
I love that. I want to pause real quick. I've got, if you have any questions, we can answer them on your side too, but One of my viewers here asked if it was important that it was Saturday, and I'll let you talk on this, but I think that's wildly important. You can't understate how important that is, that it's the day Saturday. If you want to speak to that.
Right. And you get that question a lot, actually, because it seems like, in the spirit of the law, the concept is just having one day out of seven. But God is a little more particular than that, in that even when he was creating the world, the seventh day is the one that he sanctified. That's the one that he distinguished. Matter of fact, if we think about in terms of naming something, like when you're going to have an animal that you're going to be slaughtering later, they typically recommend you don't name it, because when you name it, you get attached to it, right? So giving something a name illustrates a level of emotional investment into this thing. So when we think about the days of the week, you have the first day, the second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. Then the seventh day gets a name. The seventh day is called a Sabbath. So there's a level of emotional investment that God has to the Sabbath. And then when it's reiterated to the children of Israel later at Sinai, it's still the seventh day. So we see that God himself doesn't change. And when we kind of come to the subject, understanding that there's that level of importance to God on it, who are we really to change it? Yep.
100%. I mean, I think it's, as someone that is guilty of having not kept it for years. I used to keep it. I was a pro snowboarder. We had snowboard clothing company. We were really wrapped up in snowboarding, and it was really, you needed to snowboard on the weekends. That's when all the people were out of school, and God put it in our heart to not snowboard on Saturdays. I know that maybe sounds ridiculous because it doesn't sound like work, but it was in the industry that we were in, and it was hard, and God always blessed that we observed it. Well, then I started in my career in golf course management, and I told the guy that I was working for when I started, I said, I only want to work 3 or 4 days a week, and I don't want to work on Saturday. And he scheduled me for 6 days that first week, including Saturday, and I did it for 20 years. And I went callous to it. And when God was really calling us out of Egypt, proverbially, we were living in Denver, and when God called us out of that to this thing we're doing now, it was a big part of it. A keystone part was observing Sabbath. We didn't know particularly what that meant. We'd work out the semantics, but God's day and resting. And it's so important that it's the day Saturday, because put your money where your mouth is with God. And if you can't make him Lord of your life, you're trying to make him your master. And if you can't, out of 7 days, you can't make one day dedicated to him, it shows you where your allegiance is, right? That's one reason. And then a big thing, and I'll get to, I wanted to ask you about Revelations later, but from what I understand, 7,000 years of creation, 6 years we work, 7th year we rest. That would be the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so we're observing God's creation, we're honoring God, and we're also as the Jewish tradition does. It's a image of the future event coming as well.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So, yeah, it's funny you had mentioned something there regarding your job. I've had the same trouble with certain jobs before, and it's kind of a struggle where they on and off. They'll try and schedule me on Saturdays, and then it'll go back and forth between me fighting with them over Shabbats, and I've tried to reason with them before, and it's just something that I've noticed throughout my working years, that when I have to work on the Sabbath, it is as slow as could possibly be. And whenever I'm not working on the Sabbath, apparently they're so busy, they wish they had me there. And so it's kind of one of those where it's like, look, I'm not superstitious. I'm just telling you that it's in your financial benefit to not make me work on Saturday.
Yeah, and God blesses those who you bless, and curses those who you curse. So you should really bless me. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I can tell you, for me, when I'm doing something on Saturday, and I'm not trying to be religious. I'm not a religious person. I don't go to church. I don't, like you were talking earlier about all the Baptist rule. I'm not a super legalistic person, but when my wife and I talk about should we go to town on this Saturday? And sometimes we will, and we're there's a little bit of an offness about it. So, it's good if you're a Christian. If you're Jewish, obviously you probably already you should be following it. It's something that is hard to maybe do. I'm not trying to condemn anybody, but it feels amazing to go, hey, Friday night, cutting it off. I'm honoring God. I'm going to try and be sensitive to what he wants us to do, whatever that is. I'm dedicating this day. And I promise you, just like letting your field rest was actually for your good, it would be for your good, and there'll be a blessing in it. So whatever. I think
Right. And one of the things I like to point out too is that, look, Sabbath observance on the seventh day of the week, on Saturday, that's something that can be biblically substantiated, and we can prove it from both Old Testament and New. Obviously, in the Old Testament, that's what they observed, but even in the New Testament, in the Book of Acts, we can point to several places where we see that not only were the Jews meeting in the synagogues on the Sabbath day, but the Gentiles were also there with them. But there isn't a single example in the New Testament of these new believers meeting on Sunday. All of the examples where you see the first day of the week, there actually is a caveat within the text that indicates that it's actually Saturday night. So they would be meeting for what we call Havdalah, which is the candle lighting ceremony where you end the Shabbat. That's customary. People gather together for that.
I mean, from what I understand, the Sunday worship thing happened at the Council of Nicene. It was Copernicus and, Constantine. Sorry, Copernicus. I was doing a study on that earlier. Sorry, Constantine. It's. I don't want to again condemn anybody, but to me, around that time when Christianity merged with Catholicism and started, worshiping on Sundays, we missed the boat there. The Christian church started this deviation into a dark water. So, and that's kind of I love what you're doing. And I don't want to look, we've had discussions on my live, how perfect do you have to be? And do you have to be holy and you have to be righteous? And I don't want to put that yoke on anybody because as a sinner myself, I want to have a heart for God. I want to do well, but I know I can't be perfect, but on the same hand, that doesn't mean you punt on it, right? That doesn't mean you just go, whatever, God, Jesus saved me and I'm out. So and if you're trying, that's got to be a good step. So.
Right. And that's kind of how I explain it to people is look, this is not something you do for salvation. That's the New Testament actually is very clear on that. And any Orthodox Jew would tell you, look, if you're obeying the Torah to try to get to heaven, you're coming at it wrong. You're way off. It's not something intended for that purpose. It is intended though to help strengthen your relationship with God. But it's kind of one of those things where the boundaries of the covenant of marriage do not apply to you until you're married. So if we view the marriage as what salvation is, right? That's salvation is when you get involved in the relationship. Now you're in the covenant, but being part of the covenant, now the rules of a married person now apply to you.
That is huge.
You can't commit adultery against someone that you're not married to.
I've never thought of that before. And we've done the teaching on here about, Yeshua proposing to us with the wine, and we took the wine and we drank it. And that idea of when you accept salvation, it's a consummation of the marriage. That's heavy and beautiful.
Absolutely. Wow. And that's, it really is a beautiful thing because it's like the way I've explained it before is first of all, we live in a physical world. I get that our salvation is achieved by means that are not physical. It's by grace through faith. I'm all about that 100%. But we live in a physical world, right? So you're married, you love your wife, but could you, if you could just for a moment think really hard, is there any way that you could take what is internal, right? You love your wife, that's an internal thing. Okay. Is there any way that you could take that and make it cognitively accessible to her that is not physical?
Or write a rule book for other people for them to get what I'm doing and then do what I do because I wrote out a SOP on it. I wrote out a procedure manual on it. It's really hard to quantify.
Right. And so it's like your wife knows that you love her because you do things to demonstrate that you love her. So if we love God, that is an internal thing for sure. But God has laid out basically his own list of love languages that he's written out and said, this is how I want you to show me that you love me. And that's a privilege because, in a marriage, we don't get that.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And it's so beautiful. That God presented the love dynamic that we have with him in the male-female role, And so many times he talks about, how he loves Israel and how they're fornicating and they're, they're very reckless with his heart in general. And when I say Israel, I mean, yes, Israel, like that happens a lot, but I also all the children of God, like we're reckless with God's heart. And, if you can, like I've said on here before, we end up getting the discussion about living holy, living perfect. And I just like, I always talk about David, like, he made huge mistakes, but he didn't mean to, and he wanted to love God. He had a heart for God, and they had a really good relationship. So like, you can't substitute that. And like, to me, that's a really good starting point to try and figure out what you should be doing. Try and get your heart recalibrated on the Father. Try and have that love reciprocation relationship. And then it's going to be harder and harder for you to just sin. It's just going to be harder.
Right. It's funny. One of the books that I read, and I recommend, but only to certain people. It is called Lessons in Tanya, and it's a Jewish work, and it's philosophical, predominantly to explain the spiritual nature of our relationship with God and how the things we do can and do affect that. From charity to fasting to just obedience and sin. And so, what it explains actually is that all sin is equated with idolatry, and that is because when the Torah says that Adonai Echad, God is one, and I've made a video about this recently, explaining that God is only, and that is to say that He's the only true existence. That everything that exists really is almost a fractalization of the whole, which is God, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
So you, the chair that you're sitting in, me, the devices that we're communicating on, it's all part of a whole that is God. And so to have the arrogance to assume and to then act as though we exist independent of God, which is what sin is, right? When you sin, you're doing what you want to do as though you're somehow independent of God. Well, that makes you a God above Him. That is idolatry.
Yeah, well,
right.
That's going to be in my head you see that TikTok video, what video lives in your head? That one. That lives in my head forever now. So cool. Yeah, it's brilliant though. And like my area of study is conspiracy, science, intelligent designs, defending intelligent design. And if you research quantum field theory, have you ever heard the term quantum field theory, or have you ever researched it at all?
Yes.
So with quantum field theory, you can maybe correct me then because I'm a real novice at it. There's 3 building blocks. I think it's 2 quarks and a neutrino or vice versa. And they're the Lego blocks that create this reality. And there's no difference between the space between us, the flesh in our body, that makes up our body, the chair. It's all made up of the same 3 building blocks. So like this idea of it all being God and us all being connected and it being this, complicated reality that we were taught it was some simple, space-time matter, Einsteinian thing, but it's not. It's more complicated than that. And us being an extension of God or in with God currently, I think is scientifically backed with that idea of quantum field theory.
Right. And it also, if you think about it, it also explains the omnipresence aspect.
Amen. 100%. And it also explains that Lucifer, not to take it to a dark area, is trying to synthesize his own version of an omniscience with Google and with human brain interfacing and this 5G and I'm not going to get super conspiracy, but he's trying to create a synthetic digital version of omnipresence.
Yes. Yes. Agreed.
And I think that's this wasn't something we talked about in our messages, but I think when Christians really, I got good Christian friends that are always beating themselves up. Am I saved? If the end comes, am I okay? And I try to explain, if you have a heart for God, I believe you're okay. And when God is going to judge this world, and this might be me, I'm not trying to be too liberal, but it's not particularly the sinner Christian who knows he's broken. There's a group of elite people on this earth that are trying to entirely repurpose and counterfeit and destroy God's order. And that's where I think the major judgment is coming. Yes, we sin, but the times we've seen this major this major judgment was the flood, Babel, Sodom. Each one of these times, there's this reckless group of individuals repurposing God's reality. So I think that bin is I think that's where judgment's coming. And I think that, there's scripture that says that we're going to watch God judge them And it's going to be awesome because they're like, they're hurting God's creation. They're offending God. They're all these things. And I just think, look, we're all sinners. I'm not giving anybody a golden pass. I just think that there's like an enemy of God out there, and it's not us particularly. And when Jesus was on the earth, he didn't get mad at sinners. You know, he healed them. He was with them. But who did he get mad at? You know, he overturned the religious right, the money tables, and these like this kind of the religious like institution that was supposed to be representing him. And rather than representing him, they were trying to kill him. Like, that's who he was mad at.
Right. Right. It's one of those things too, where I think it's even Paul who says that, look, those who are outside of the law will be judged outside of the law. There is what we call ignorance. Look, yeah, you can only do what you know to do that is right, and you can only avoid doing what you know you shouldn't be doing. Yep. And there are certain moral truths that even Judaism accepts as being universal, and easy to understand. Things like murder, obviously, and those would be laws that breaking those would be breaking a law. It goes against nature, and so it's those that I guess you could say we're expected to keep for anybody who doesn't know any better. We are fortunate to live in a country where we can look and study and research, but there are people who don't have the technology that we have. They don't have the resources that we have, and there's no way that they could know what we know. So if you're going to tell me that a just God is going to condemn that person based on what there was no possible way for them to know, I have a problem with that, and I would say Scripture has a problem with that.
And when I argue with atheists or agnostics, people that are mad at God, they'll say, so the guy in the Aboriginal tribe that never met Jesus is going to hell? Is that what you're saying? And I go, I've never said, like, look, first off, I'm not deciding who goes to hell. There's one that's worthy, and that's God, and I'm going to let him judge, but like what you just said, if you have access, like, you have access to the information and are denying it, and you're trying to use this straw man of this guy, in some forest. He doesn't have access. So, like, it's just a straw man argument. But, yeah, 100% in line with what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And you said, I'm still stuck on the thing in my head that you told me. But as far as going back to, like, how we keep the law, a scripture when you were telling me that came to mind is the one where the tree gets grafted in, right? Where the Gentiles get grafted into the tree. At that point,
Romans 11.
You're not separate from the tree. And if you try and separate from the tree, you're not going to make it. You need the vascular supply. You need the nutrients. You need the root system.
Yep. It's actually, I almost like the way that Paul words it in Ephesians 2 better. Romans 11 is a really good one. The tree analogy is wonderful in understanding kind of where the vitality flows from. He even says you don't sustain the root sustains you. Now, a lot of people try and dissect what the root is and try and figure out some way for the root not to be Judaism, but the root is Judaism. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's what it always was.
What would be the argument for that?
So the argument would be, the most common one that I've heard is that the root is Christ.
Nope.
Yeah, right. It doesn't seem to make any sense. And that's where I'm like, look, this is why I love Ephesians 2, because Ephesians 2, Paul is describing what it's like to be unsaved and not grafted in. So, he says, you Gentiles who were once far away from the covenants of promise, cut off from the covenants of promise, right? You have now, by the blood of Christ, been brought near. So there's this. He builds this idea of, yes, you were another, like you were out there, you were not one of us. Yeah. But because of Jesus, now you can become one of us. Not this new religion that we're going to join and you're joining. No, we are still us. You are now joining us. Yeah. Like that's the idea, right? God made his covenant with Israel at Sinai. Like they had their Exodus. That's when God sanctified them. He set them apart. Balaam, the prophet, what he says to the kings who were asking him to try and curse Israel, he says, look, God says they are not numbered among the nations. They're not like the rest of us. So they've already got their covenant with God. What's been left out is the rest of the world. And so what Jesus accomplishes, what Yeshua accomplishes, is bringing the rest of the world into that covenant.
That is so. I've marginalized the thing that we're talking about. I knew I wanted to talk to you about it, but that is the idea that God had really specifically talked to this Jewish group. And if you take it back to the origin, there was basically who God made his covenant with and everyone else. And everyone else at that time was wicked into pagan, occult, Baal. It wasn't like, Abraham and his crew and like some like lukewarm people. It was like sacrificing children, all kind of things. And so like you could see how like granted over the years that eroded down to a less, invasive species of, anti-God or whatever, but the Gentiles being given the opportunity to get in there through what Jesus did is like probably seriously overlooked by the standard Sunday Christian, individual. They probably don't even realize how important that is, and then they say things like, "I'm saved. I don't need the Torah. I don't need to follow the rules." And I've always struggled with that because, like, to me, you're being really manic in your discussion, and it's, I'm saved by grace, therefore I don't have to try. And like, Jesus was like, always try. Like, don't sin. Try to like. He wasn't this loosey-goosey thing, and it's almost like that pagan, Gentile world got like a golden ticket a little bit and is still doing the thing that they did before. I don't know.
It's kind of I feel like personally the reason that confusion comes about is it's a couple of things. There's a lot of moving parts to it, but essentially the thought process is that the nature of sin changed. Now they would never admit this because they know that it sounds ridiculous and it's completely unbiblical when you think about it in terms like that. But they already acknowledge that the law is what defines sin, right? But if the law defines sin, but now because of Jesus we don't have to do it, then what you're saying is that the nature of what sin is has effectively changed, so that now that things that were sin before are now not sin. Like that's what you are saying happened without saying it in plain terms. And so the easiest kind of way around that is to ask them, like, okay, well, explain to me how the nature of sin changed.
They would have no answer for that. And that's for sure. And it's just kind of like, this is going to, before I say this, I'll make sure everybody knows I'm not Torah observant, like, to some level where I am some sinless person. So I'm just not that. But
nobody is.
Standard Sunday Christian, I'm going to say standard. How about the worst version of the Sunday Christian is, that they dress really nice and they go to church for an hour on Sunday and then they live the rest of their life like everybody else. They do Christmas and Easter and Halloween and they, whatever. They just live like everybody else and they go to church for an hour on Sunday and they feel really good about themselves for doing it. And it's just more complicated than that. What we're supposed to be doing is more complicated than that, unfortunately. And I think that as we're talking, the opportunity of being grafted in to the amazing blessing of now trying to be in this family, a very regimented, blessed, intense family. If you were adopted, if you were some just secular in the street normal person, and next thing you knew you were adopted by some really well off, really regimented, disciplined family, and you just jumped in there and you're like, well, I'm just going to do what I was doing before, it's not going to go well, right? Like you're like, wow, I'm in this house and like I need to make sure I'm doing the right thing. So like it's just whatever. I'm diverging with that, but it makes so much sense.
Absolutely. The adoption analogy is a beautiful one, actually, because it's one that a parent can always relate to. It's like, look, you have kids, you have your natural born kids. So if you adopted another set of children that are not natural born to you, would you give them a separate set of house rules, or would you expect them to live by the same standard as your natural born kids?
I'd even be more critical of them because they're not your blood children.
Right. Right. Now, here is one thing about that in Judaism that's a little beautiful, actually, is that you can't disown kids that you adopt
Yeah.
in Judaism
Yeah.
because you chose that, right?
Wow.
Your natural born kids you didn't choose. Like that just happened. It's that's what God gave you.
Yeah.
But if you choose to adopt a child that's not yours, you chose that. That's on
Wow.
you.
So that okay. So I don't know how old that rule is. I assume it's fairly old. It's before Messiah, maybe, or
I
there's.
would wager to say, yeah. I myself don't know the age of it, but I would wager that that's the case.
What if that's God, as God gently does? He does this beautiful thing with his Jewish people that he like makes them observe certain messianic things. Say Passover. I had a dream one night that, and I could be way off base here, so God forgive me, but I had a dream and I was preaching, which I'm not a preacher. It was really bizarre, and I basically had this revelation that the Jews are required to keep Passover because they denied that Yeshua was Messiah, even though I know God hardened their hearts, whatever, however that worked. But he's making them observe the death, the sacrifice of the lamb annually, even though they don't accept Yeshua as the Lamb of God. Like they do this whole ceremony, and it's like clearly Messiah centric. And so like this rule thing with having to, you can't get rid of the child that you adopted. It could be God telling them, reminding himself, that he's like, you can't, we adopted these Gentiles, we got to keep them. Like maybe, I don't know. It's a really pretty thing that you're telling me.
It's that whole scenario is an interesting one because a parent can adopt a child and it can be fully legal and everything, but you can't make the natural born children accept the adopted child as a sibling. That has to happen organically. You can't just make it happen. And so I that's kind of where I've found my peace is like I know that I'm probably not accepted as a sibling by Orthodox Judaism, but that's okay. Because you're right. The scripture does say that they were blinded to the truth, specifically to the messiahship of Jesus. A caveat of mine, or really a pet peeve of mine, is when people try and use this verse about the Jews being veiled as an excuse to disregard anything that any Jew ever said about the Bible. It's like, no, they were only blinded to one thing. That's the messiahship of Jesus. And what does Paul say? He says that was for our benefit, right? That's for the benefit of the Gentiles, because so this is a Jewish understanding about messianic times. The day that every single Jew in the world accepts Messiah, that's it. That's when the end comes.
For sure.
So if it were to happen in the time of Jesus,
Yep.
if when Jesus was here on earth, every Jew in Israel accepted him at that point,
Yep.
the Gentile world would have no hope.
Yep.
There would be no hope for the Gentile world.
And as far as I understand it, the penalty for sin is death. And Yeshua was not sinning, so he would have lived forever, and he would have been on his throne as Messiah, and we would all be going straight to hell. So
right.
So thank God
right.
for the Jews, right? That's why you don't judge. Like it's first off, it's not your place. Like if you think that your place in this world is to judge God's people, you're wrong. Like there's not
right.
things that I know that you're wrong about. And then it's complicated where God hardens their hearts. There's a certain there's a give and pull, and it's a relationship that you don't need to speak on, you don't need to worry about, and you just don't worry about judging God's people. You just, hey, whatever, it's God, it's between them and God, and I'm gonna butt out, right? Like that's, to me, that's the take you need to have that, because exactly, if they would have accepted him, it would have been a whole different ballgame, and it needed to happen that way. And when he comes back, if I understand the Zechariah prophecy correctly, God's going to pour out a spirit of supplication and grace, and they're going to get it, and they're going to weep for him like you weep. It's going to be like this epiphany, and they're going to accept him, and it's going to be amazing, and that's to come.
Like when Joseph's brothers finally realized who he was.
Dude, I was researching your content today, and I had never known the Joseph thing. I mean, if the people in here want to hear it, I've thought about it since I watched it. I was trying to tell my wife about it. So profound. Would you mind giving like a couple minute thing on it?
Sure. Yeah, just kind of briefly. within Judaism, there are teaching. There was an understanding that would be a dual messianic coming. Okay, the Judaism, at least ancient, not ancient Judaism, but at least as far as the Gra is what he's called. As far as his understanding was, is he understood there would be two messianic comings. There's one that he understood to be the Messiah, the son of Joseph. This is to be not to mean that Joseph would literally be his father, but that he would resemble the character of Joseph from Genesis, and he would be a suffering servant the same way that Joseph was. But then the conquering king would come second. That would be the second one. That Messiah would come, and he would be the son of David, the conquering king, obviously. And it's the relationship of the Messiah to Joseph is a fascinating one, because it's kind of what we see in the figure of Jesus. Now, a lot of my followers who are Jewish, they're not believers at all. They get a little annoyed by this, and I do understand and I respect that. And so I'll ask them to bear with me if they're watching right now. But the story of Joseph is one where he was cast off by his brothers. They hated him, and they cast him to the Gentile world. They gave him over to Egypt. So what happened in the story is that Egypt then took him and dressed him up and made him second to Pharaoh, made him somewhat of a god almost. And he didn't look like a Hebrew anymore. So when his brothers came to see him later in the story, they didn't recognize him because he didn't look like one of them. He didn't look like a brother to them. And he doesn't reveal himself to his brothers until the end of the story. And one of the interesting things to note about that is Joseph actually, he clears all of the Egyptians out of the room before he reveals himself. He makes sure that there's no Gentiles in the room, you could say, before he comes to his brothers and says, "I am Joseph. I'm your brother." And so that is kind of what we see in the figure of Yeshua, is that, yes, so he was cast off and then he was given over to the pagan world. The Christian church, as it is, has built him up to look like some blonde-haired, blue-eyed Greek philosopher who abolished the Torah. He looks like a false prophet. And according to Deuteronomy 13, like all of Deuteronomy 13 applies to him as a false prophet under that premise. But I think at the end of things, he will reveal himself to his brothers and tell them, I am Joseph.
It is so profound because, when Jesus was on the earth, they expected this conquering, get us out of Rome. We're under, the Rome oppression. And he wasn't doing that. He came in peace. He came to accomplish this other messianic duty. And I had never thought of the Joseph thing, but with Joseph, he was supposed to be this chosen son, this son of promise. And he kind of, he was like, this is going to be a big deal. And next thing you know, he sold into slavery. Things go off the rails. That kind of happened with Yeshua, obviously. And then just this idea that he was transfigured, so much so they didn't recognize him. In your video, you talked about, Christmas and Easter and like the different pagan things. And it's just, it's in that same vein. And that's what the Torah, you and I didn't talk about this earlier when we were messaging, but the Torah, I have this concept that it creates this reality. I mean, that's not my concept. It says it in John that the word creates this reality, but that somehow it's a story that's responsible for the creation of this reality. It told an actual story historically that happened, and it is telling a story that is going to happen, and it's also happening in real time in everybody's lives, and it's multidimensional. We couldn't possibly understand it. I mean, the closer we get to quantum physics and stuff, we might be able to kind of put it together. But the Joseph story, we all love it. A couple of my commenters are talking about this. That idea of, God's chosen you, and then you have to go into prison. He goes into prison, right? And things go way off the rails for him, and he's having to have integrity the whole time. And even if he's doing the right thing, he's being charged by the law for, doing something that he didn't. It's just, it totally reminds me of the story, and it's beautiful, and I hadn't heard that before. And then when he comes back, he's the conqueror, the conquering Messiah.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned what John 1 says about the Word creating this reality, because so that it actually says that in Genesis 1 also, but it's it's in the nitty gritty of the Hebrew there. So it's funny you had mentioned earlier, kind of like maybe discussing like my favorite, little tidbit of information that you wouldn't get without Hebrew,
yes.
And that's really what this is. So especially when you get into the Trinitarian discussion, John 1 comes up a lot, right? And it's almost as if nobody recognizes the thematic repetition in the nature of John 1, right? It's like we read in the beginning was the Word, and we just totally forget that that's connected to Genesis 1:1. It's intended to make us think of Genesis 1:1. So Genesis 1:1 says in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim vet haaretz. That loosely translates as in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But and this is a lesson that I've got in my videos. So if I butcher it here, you can go back and see a little bit of a better explanation. But Bereshit is actually grammatically incorrect for that verse. It doesn't read as in the beginning. If you wanted to lay that out in a sequential way in Hebrew, you would use Bereshana, which basically means at first God created the heavens and the earth, or this is the first thing that happened, right? Bereshit is construct form. So the way it reads in Hebrew is almost as if there's something intended to come after it between that and God created the heavens and the earth. So it really reads as in the beginning of, God created the heavens and the earth. And it almost appears like a word is missing, right? The interesting thing about Hebrew is that a lot of the words are basically compound words built up of more than one word. So you can actually read it literally if you separate the bait from the rest of the word, right? So you get ba and then reshit, two separate words, right? So the bait basically would mean like by or with. So we have with reshit, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, what you can do is you can take the word reshit and look at every time in the Torah that it's mentioned as a noun. Okay. Now, every time in the Torah that it's mentioned as a noun, you get majority of two outcomes. Either it refers to the children of Israel or it refers to the commandments of the Torah. So we can plug that back into the text. You get two outcomes. Either with the Jews, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But with the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? It's right there in the first verse. It's because it's grammatically incorrect, right? And it doesn't make any sense in Hebrew unless you do this with it. That is the beauty of the Hebrew language.
And I've heard that it's grammatically incorrect. One of the things and I talked about a long time ago was the whole behold the hand, behold the nail teaching, which I don't want to get into right now, but I've studied it, the Bereshit part a little bit. I haven't heard that, but it's such a confirmation to me that, this concept, whether we understand it or not, that the Torah is creating this reality is in the first line of both Genesis and then John. And then, if we do this again, or even if not, I made a YouTube documentary called The Operating System. And my theory is that if we're in a simulated reality, and we'll talk about that in a second, but if this is a simulation, if God chose that technology to create this reality, computer simulations, computer codes are what drive, the program. So you've got source code. And my documentary that I made was way over my head as far as understanding what I was talking about. But it was this idea that the source code is the Torah, not the entirety of the Old and New Testament, but Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers is the source code creating this reality. And I know there's a Jewish teaching that that he spoke the world into existence. He spoke the universe into existence, but that in some oral tradition, spoke meant he used his words, he used the Hebrew letters and then the number 0 through 9, and he wrote out this reality. So it all kind of jives, and it's a fun thing to play with, but whether we get it or not, just having that respect for Torah, that it's the mainframe, it's the operating system, it's responsible for this reality, and it's a story that happened where God gave these people free will, but they still ordained their thing, and it's also telling them, it pisses me off when people say they don't believe in the Bible. I'm just like, whatever. You're just mad at God.
Right. It's the first and most hyperlinked document in all of history. Yeah,
in every sense, in multi dimensions, it's unbelievable. And it is. It's believable and amazing. I shouldn't say the word unbelievable there. So a couple other questions to bang out that I want to make sure we get off the list. This is a big one, and especially in my group, like we've got a few of us that are content creators, and then some people that are always some brothers and sisters I would consider in these lives, and we're really trying to honor God, and we're trying to know what we're supposed to do. So can you shed some light on the name, how we're supposed to approach the name? Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, Yahusha. What's your take on that?
So I tend to side with a more Orthodox Jewish perspective on this. Now I understand a lot of the theories on it. Particularly, like I'm familiar with Nehemiah Gordon's research. In basically, he just takes the nikud, the vowel points of Hebrew, and injects them into the word, and that's how you get his version of it. The command to not profane the name of God, that I would equate to not pronouncing it. And the reason for that is I bring this up in another TikTok actually. I don't remember the exact passage in Leviticus, so you can reference the TikTok for that. But there's a passage in Leviticus where an Israelite, he's born of an Israelite woman, but his father is not Israeli, and he curses another Jew and uses the name of God to curse him. Okay. And he is put to death for it. Now, when it says that he profaned the name, it doesn't say that it doesn't say he profaned the name the way that we would understand that in English. It literally just says that he pronounced it. Like that's all it says, is that he pronounced it. And this was his great sin. And so he was effectively put to death for it. Now, in addition to that, nobody actually knows how to pronounce the name anymore. That has been lost to time for longer than we could probably even calculate. They've surmised that it was lost somewhere around the Babylonian captivity. And there is, I guess, evidence that it might have been pronounced a little more commonly prior to that. But even as it is, since then, nobody's known how to pronounce it. There are no vowels in Hebrew by nature. Matter of fact, there's no vowel points in Hebrew at all. So the vowel points that we read there are intended to clue you in as to whether or not you're supposed to say Elohim or Adonai instead of saying the name. That's why they're there. That's why they're different times that you see them. Because if it's the vowel points for what would be Adonai, then you would say Adonai there instead of saying the name, because you're reverencing the name. And then especially now, we don't even know how to pronounce the name. So that's one of the things I find interesting about Nehemiah Gordon's research, because he's a Karaite Jew. He doesn't accept the oral tradition, but the vowel point system in Hebrew is entirely based on the Jewish oral tradition, right? Because in the original Torah, there were no vowel points, and there are certain words in Hebrew that they use the exact same Hebrew words. The vowel points are the only thing that make them different. So there's the verse that says, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's chet lamed beit are the Hebrew letters. Okay. Now, depending on how you vocalize that with vowel points, it can be chalav or it can be chalev. Okay. Chalav would be milk. So do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. But if it's chalev, then it's fat. It's a very particular kind of fat that's around the internal organs. Like you read in Leviticus, these fats are what you burn on the altar, the ones around the kidney and the liver and whatnot. Same three Hebrew letters. The only difference is how you vowelize them. So if Nehemiah Gordon does not accept the Jewish oral tradition, we have a problem, because the entire way that he understands how to read Hebrew is based on the Jewish oral tradition. There's no other way that we would know how to pronounce those words unless there was an oral tradition passed down by which those vowel points were injected into the text.
So the first thing there is, I'm just going to go ahead and say that you gave me a pass to eat cheeseburgers, so thank you. No, I'm kidding. I know it's not, but wow, that'd be great. And then I think an important takeaway, and this resonates with what I've intuitively felt, or what, you know, the Spirit's guided me, or whatever, whatever that is. Maybe we could talk about that. But I think that you don't need to say the name, the tetragrammaton. You just don't need to say it. Like that is whole. Like when you're not supposed to use the Lord's name in vain, like that. Like you don't need to say the name. There's Father, like you said, Adonai, Elohim. Like we can refer to the personage without using the name, right?
Right. It's also implicit in fearing his name, which is another thing we're commanded to do, to fear his holy name. And this is one of those things that like Harry Potter got like right on the number, right? You know, it's the whole Harry Potter series. Everybody's terrified to even pronounce the name of Voldemort, you know, this Dark Lord figure that's the bad guy of the whole series. And kind of they all overcome that in the end as they kind of grow a little more brave and less afraid of him. So there's no need to reverence the name so much, right? So if we just take that concept and kind of reverse the evil aspect behind the figure, but that really is the kind of fear we should have, is like, look, this is the name of the guy who could zap you out of existence. It would be like you were never even born. Like it wouldn't even be like you were and now you aren't. It would be like you never were to begin with. Yep. Like you should fear somebody who has that power. But in addition to that, right, it's like God is a few things to us. I get the marriage narrative, right? I get the marriage allegory. But in addition to that, he is our king and he is our father, right? You don't call a king by his first name. Okay. You call him by the title, because the title is what separates you from him. Okay. Right. The title is what puts him on a higher level than what you are, is the fact that you can't call him by his name. You call him by the title. Okay. Because it is impersonal. And that's a lot of people's problem. It's like, well, titles are impersonal. I'm like, yeah, that's the point.
This is God.
And then your father. You don't call your father by his first name. Never. That is so disrespectful.
Oh, amen. Right in your core, you feel it. Calling your mom by her name. Yeah. So okay. So I've said, you know, Hashem is a name for father. Well, what would you suggest when we're trying to respectfully talk to the Father? What's the best way to address him?
So one of the things to look up, actually, particularly in terms of prayer, is what each title denotes, because each title denotes something just a little bit different. Adonai is a masterful name. Adonai is a title of authority. It's what a slave would call their master. So that's not really, that's when you're seeking forgiveness and repentance, that's not really that's not the name that, or the title that you would appeal to. Elohim is the judge. Elohim is the one that you would appeal to for forgiveness. But also you can just sum it all up in Hashem. It literally just means the name, but that's, you know, how else do we call him other than, you know, the name?
And so we talked earlier about Sunday school and what led you down this path. And just like for me, I didn't want to learn about evolution. This is a question I'm going to ask you later, but you know, this story that we were monkeys and then we cave people, and this whole narrative that we're taught, this idea that Adam and Eve were put in the garden and lived for 1,000 years, and that the society was super technologically advanced and like we've devolved, like that is so much more interesting to me than the one that we were taught. And talking to you about the right kind of names to address God in the right kind of instances is what I wanted to learn if I were to have gone to church. Like, give me the good information about how to like respectfully address the creator of the universe. That's important. Like, let's talk about the good stuff. You know, salvation. Yep. Like, that's great. We're saved, but like serving God and how you observe it and how you respect your Father and how you have like this. To me, if that's what Christians were focused on, I think it would have such a different connotation and such a level of depth and intimacy that we're just missing. And like, you got to tithe and be to church on Sunday and look good and donate your time and vote for this person and I'll see you at the Christmas service and whatever. It's a nightmare.
Right. No, with the evolution thing. So I was actually homeschooled. And I I was given a pretty unbiased education on the subject. For most subjects, I was actually just given a dictionary, the encyclopedia, and the internet, and told, "Hey, write a paper on this subject."
Yeah.
And so, most of the contrary to popular belief about homeschooling, most of the opinions that I've gotten on things are from independent research. It's not from having my parents force an opinion down my throat.
Wow.
One of the primary flaws I find with the evolutionary narrative is one of logical consistency, actually. Just in terms of, if we accept the idea that religion is man-made, which is what the evolutionary theory would attempt to posit, then I have a problem, because evolution, as the theory goes, posits the notion that simple life forms became more complex, right? And even in terms of cognitive self-consciousness, it became more complex as time went on, right? And so we, human beings with our current ability for self-consciousness, evolved from a being that had a less of a capability for that level of self-consciousness, right? A more simple being. So since religion has existed as far back as we can trace in human history and validate by any form of document, we have a problem, because you're telling me that it was invented, and that it was invented by beings who were much more simple than we are in terms of self-consciousness, by beings that probably couldn't even conceive of their own self-consciousness fully. But you want me to believe that those beings were able to conceive of a supreme consciousness outside of themselves that created everything. So like the logical inconsistency is, like, if you can't even conceive of your own self-consciousness, how are you going to then conceive of an external self-consciousness outside of yourself, outside of the world in which you exist, outside of the dimension in which you exist? How do you come to that as a being that can't even conceive of your own self-consciousness?
Yeah.
That's a logical problem.
No, absolutely. I mean, I like to deal more in the hard science, and the idea that it doesn't make any rational sense scientifically, but this idea of looking into the consciousness, and I mean, yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that more etherical idea, but that's beautiful. And I do want to get into the evolution thing, but I think it's going to be a long conversation. So before we do, because I've been asked this a couple times, okay, so we're not going to address the Father with the official, his name. Hey, name, we're going to go by Hashem. We like that a lot. Father, I think, is fair. What about Messiah, Yeshua? What would you suggest there?
Gotcha. So I am not a Trinitarian. I am. You can call it Unitarian, but the Unitarian Church, I think, has a couple of other caveats that I don't know that I would agree with. If God is one and God is the only, in terms of like we discussed earlier, like everything is a fractalization of the whole, which is God. Then I just don't know how you can get three out of that. Now, I know how you can get any number of other emanations from that. And an emanation is of such that it would be a poor example. But, when you see light come through the window in the morning, right, you say, oh, that's the sun. Well, that's not the sun. That's the light that's radiating from the sun. But we associate it as being synonymous with the sun, because it does come from the sun. And so this is more or less biblically how the Messiah, the Holy Spirit, the Shekinah, and the seven spirits of God. That's another problem I have with the Trinity, is, like, if we want to argue about emanations that come from God, there are clearly more than three in the Old Testament alone. I don't even need the New Testament to come to that conclusion. But to pray to Jesus, I find problematic just because Jesus didn't even command to pray to himself. Now, he said to pray in his name. Now, to pray in the name of, to do anything in the name of someone else, especially in a Hebraic concept, is not just using the name as an invocation. It's not using their name as a magic spell to seal the prayer or anything like that. No, it means that you are coming in the same spirit, in the same authority, and with the same heart that they do. That you are coming as their representative, more or less. That's the idea. So Jesus tells us to pray to the Father in his name. So definitely, yes, you pray in Yeshua's name, for sure. I would never tell anybody not to do that. But I probably wouldn't pray to him. Because
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I was more so talking about the name we would use, because there's discussion about Yahusha, but I'm glad you talked about that, because I've seen your videos. The reason I don't want to dive fully into it is because I've seen your take and it makes total sense to me. And then the guys that you end up kind of debating, a lot of times they're just kind of dogmatic evangelicals, whatever. And like what I said in one of your comments is, when it gets kind of interpretable, such as Revelations, you and I talked about that, and I've seen some, you can use one scripture to kind of justify it one way and one another way. I think I'm careful to just go rigidly, it's this, and if that, then you're wrong, because of what we talked about earlier with all different kinds of denominations and division. And I think that, a lot of times, my heart is for the atheist and the agnostic, and to get them to know who God, their Father, is, and understand that their relationship was fractured, and that it doesn't mean that God isn't real. And when you end up infighting over semantics, I'm not that that's a semantic. I get praying to the Holy Spirit or praying to Jesus is kind of a big one, but I can sense them wondering why we're doing what we're doing when we can't even figure out what we're doing, and we're busy infighting. So I think the major things, and I'm not trying to be liberal in this, but there's one God. He's the Father that we're talking about, the author of the Bible. You cannot get to heaven on your own righteousness. So Yeshua was sent as the sacrifice, and that was a sufficient covering for your sin condition, and that he was resurrected from the dead. And then, we're going to figure all this out at one point. But for now, I love what you said. And I feel led a lot of times to pray to the Father in the name of Yeshua. I feel that's kind of how, to simplify it, I feel like that's a safe route to take, right? You're praying to the Father in the name of Yeshua, just like what Jesus had said. And I think, there's some chat in here. I know demons listen to the name of Jesus. I've heard aliens listen to the name of Jesus if people are being abducted, and that's a whole conversation about demons and aliens. But that that people have been we're a bit ritually abducted, and then in the name of Jesus, the aliens had to stop whatever. So if aliens are listening and demons are listening, it's probably effective, and it's a semantic, but.
Right. So I would say in that what they are respecting is not the words that are audibly spoken so much as the name that they're spoken in. To again reintroduce the concept. What they are respecting is the authority in which you come. Right? Because that's the authority that we're given. Not so much the words per se. Because if you're going to try and rationalize to me how something we say in the 21st century affects spiritual beings, just as a word process of invocation, then we have a problem with how it was done before English existed. So the way that makes sense is that yes, it would work in any language, because the faith being expressed is really what's at work there. Amen. But in terms of being respectful, and being historically accurate, then yes, it would either be Yehoshua or Yeshua. I recently saw a video of somebody trying to justify how it would be Jesus because the New Testament was written in Greek, and it's the manuscripts we currently have are in Greek. But
Wouldn't, I mean, if you were
There's
going
no
to,
logical reason to believe that the Gospels themselves were written in Greek, especially given that most of them maintain a Hebrew syntax. So it's a Hebrew word order, but they're all in Greek. And then we have three church historians from the early church historians who confirmed that there was a Hebrew copy of Matthew that was used by the Ebionites.
wow, I didn't know that. That's beautiful. And wouldn't, it went from Joshua to Iesu to Jesus, right? Isn't Jesus isn't it Joshua? Isn't that the Hebrew, like the Hebrew name?
So yeah, it it went from so if it was, we'll accept that it was Yeshua in the first century, because that would be the Aramaic version, or even the short form Hebrew version. It's like the difference between Brad and Bradley, right? um, so if we just accept the premise that it was Yeshua, then when translated into Greek, it would have been Yesuas. So really, the way they're pronouncing it in Greek is not correct. If you look at the Greek spelling, you can see how it's like, oh, that's the Greek way of trying to pronounce this Hebrew word. It's a transliteration, right? It's when it gets translated into Latin that this becomes more similar to the Jesus that we know today, because then Jesus was then the next evolution of that phase. Okay. So it went from Yeshua to Yesuas to Jesus to Jesus.
Yeah. And what's so important about what you're saying is that it's not the invocation of the formation of the letters like that. I mean, if you want to get into like magic and that there is some power in you know how you say words or whatever, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about in the representation of what Jesus did. And I'll give a terrible example, but being in the golf industry for 20 years, I could call up a golf course and tell the head pro there, I'd say, I got 4 buddies coming to play golf. Will you take care of them? And they'll say, yeah, well, you know, based on the relationship that I had forged with them. And so I would tell my buddies, I would go, not to be sacrilegious, but you're there in my name. You're there representing the 20 years that I've put in the golf industry and the relationships that I've cobbled. Don't make an ass of me. Please don't. Like, please.
Right.
Don't get drunk and roll the cart and try to hit on the beer cart girl and whatever. And a couple times it did, and it looks bad. It's like that's more the idea of in the name. It's not I use this 6 letters and I say them. It's because of what he did, because of his place in the order. That's what you speak to. And it's so easy for us as Christians to be religious and say the name of Jesus, in the name of Jesus. And it's like it's just easy for us to screw it up. And it's much bigger than how you say the name. There's much more to it than that.
I definitely get that it's a comfort thing. You know, I still say Jesus because that's who people understand that I'm talking about. To people who do know better, I'll say Yeshua, because that's, for me, it does come to a term of being respectful. You know, if somebody moves here from Guatemala and his name is Juan, I'm not going to call him John. Yeah, right. His name is Juan, okay. Right?
All right. Well, and I'm getting some feedback that this is splitting hairs. So as to not split hairs, and because time is limited, I would love your take. There's a couple big, I was going to end on the big one, but just, okay, should we talk about evolution or revelations? Which one do you want?
Man, I have enough time to do both if you want.
All right. So, I'm feeling more led to go to the revelation side. So what, I made a video. I don't know if you follow my content at all, but I made a video with concern of the white horse, and there's a way to interpret it that, you know, World Health Organization and the vaccine is the conquering and the coronavirus and all of that kind of thing. And, you know, the next thing that comes is war and then hyperinflation. And as I make this, like, I'm not trying to say thus saith the Lord or so it is, but making connections as a Christian conspiracy theorist. And I'm getting a lot of revelations already happened. That already happened. And you're having been as well versed as you are, what's your stance on revelations? Did it happen? Is it happening? Are we there? What's going on?
So my stance on revelation is such that I would say we've been living in the end times since Yeshua ascended. but it's been a long process, and it's one of those that I think if it's something we can correlate to what's happening today, it's one of those things that as time goes on, kind of the longer that the snowball rolls downhill, the faster it goes and the larger it gets. That's the effect I would say we're experiencing as far as preterism goes. And in terms of, the abomination that causes desolation having already happened, they're really the historical cases that get brought up. Like one of them, I think, was that Caligula. I think it was Caligula commissioned a statue to be built in the temple, and so everybody's like, "Yeah, see that already happened." It's like, well, he commissioned the statue; it was never built, though. So it's for if you take a good honest look, and I don't often recommend people go and watch Pastor Mike Winger. I've just had this sense about him, like most of the videos I've seen from him that I disagree with, they're very ill researched. It's like something where it's like, I personally feel like he did 10 minutes worth of research before making his video, because with a 5-minute Google search, I could prove him wrong. Yeah. Right. Like but he's got a great video. I will say, like, every now and then Blind Squirrel finds a nut. He's got a great video about preterism where he addresses pretty much all of the claims. He lists them out. He's like, look, they say this happened. They say this happened. They say this happened. Here's why that's not exactly why it doesn't necessarily line up with what the Bible says. It seems like it does at face value, but upon deeper scrutiny, it doesn't really work. Now, I think a lot of people focus on things that probably are, I would say, other. One of the things that is a constant in any of the apocalyptic judgment scenarios in the Bible, at least since Israel has been a nation, is the persecution of the Jews. So when we take the abomination that causes desolation, Jesus mentions this, and he says it was spoken about by the prophet Daniel. So he references backwards. Well, you don't find the event in Daniel. Daniel refers to something that's going to happen, right? So Jesus references backwards, Daniel references forwards, and Jesus is referencing it to his disciples as though it's something they're already familiar with, right? He doesn't tell them what it's going to be. He just says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, and they don't ask what it is. Right? They just receive the teaching as though, oh, okay, yeah, we'll be looking for it, right? They already know what it is. So it's commonly accepted that this would be what was done by Antiochus Epiphanes in the book of Maccabees, or the books of Maccabees, right? He slaughtered a pig on the altar in the temple, splashed its blood all over the walls, erected a statue of Zeus in the holy place, and proclaimed himself God there. Right? That's the abomination that causes desolation. Now, I'm not telling people that they need to be looking for that. What I typically tell people is you need to look at the surrounding scenario of what happened there. So, like, if that's the bullseye, right? The bullseye is that abomination that causes desolation. We need to be looking at everything that was happening around that scenario to really know what you should be looking for. Because are we going to be able to, like, pinpoint the exact things in Revelation? Probably not. Probably not until after it's already done. But we can definitely recognize the more vague patterns that we see. Now, one thing that is constant is the persecution of the Jewish people. Okay? The persecution of the Jewish people has been paramount in every apocalyptic reading regarding their existence. And that we have to acknowledge first and foremost that that's what the Bible is. The Bible, Genesis to Revelation, is a chronology of the Jewish people. And so what was happening at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes is he established an anti-Torah of sorts. He outlawed Sabbath observance. He outlawed certain sacrifices and outlawed circumcising your children. There were even points where he was oppressing people for eating a kosher diet. There's one example of a mother who had like 3 or 4 sons, I think it's 4, and every time that she refused a plate of whatever the unkosher meat was, they would bring one of her sons in and kill them in front of her. Women whose sons had been circumcised, they would kill the infant, and then chain the corpse of the infant around the neck of the mother and then make her wear that for 8 days before executing her. This is the level of atrocity that the Jewish people have had to suffer throughout history. And then we saw it happen again in the Holocaust. So what you're looking for before the end is that. You're looking for that level of persecution of the Jewish people.
So
And
that was hard to hear. The whole the temple massacre, that's tough. And the whole thing. Anyways, so I guess I'll ask the hard-hitting question. Do you have a take on the mark of the beast, the idea of the potentially the thing that we're seeing with COVID, and like, go ahead.
I've got one currently. Now, this is something that admittedly I haven't looked into Revelation in a long time. So, because I'll explain that first. So the books of John are inherently mystical. John is not a simple author. John speaks cryptically. He opens his gospel with one of the most cryptic phrases in the whole of the Bible. This, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's not a simple phrase. He is being cryptic when he's talking that way. John seems to be fascinated with the mystical. So what I figured would probably be useful is to learn a little bit of Jewish mystic thought. And that's where I studied the Tanya, where some of what we've discussed here tonight, the whole idea of the fractalization of everything and God being the whole and whatnot, that's all stuff explained in Tanya. And the idea of how idolatry works and how all sin is idolatry. These are things that the Tanya explains. So I figured I would probably gather a little bit of Jewish mystic thought and then approach the book of Daniel with that in mind, because Daniel is like the book of Revelation, but in the Old Testament. Yeah. And then from there, I would approach the book of Revelation. So I'm still approaching the book of Daniel. Okay. Right. And I'm in the middle of that. So I haven't gotten to Revelation yet. But one that makes sense to me is the regarding the mark of the beast. It says, "This is wisdom. The one who has understanding must calculate the number of the beast, because it is the number of a man, and his number is 666, right? Or 666 or 616, as certain manuscripts say." So the word number there, though, is not just of numeric value. If you look at every other instance that word number is used in the New Testament, it is giving quantities of persons. It's bodies of people, right? It's almost always used, whenever it's talking about the assembly, and the number of men in the assembly was, or, and the assembly was numbered at, and that's this Greek word. So you could almost say that it's better understood as multitude. Now, there is, I forget his name, but he was formerly part of like Hezbollah or one of these Islamic radical groups, who he did convert to Christianity, and in his research, he started studying some of the original manuscripts for Revelation, and when he came across this, he was astounded because it's not actually Greek, according to him. And what's theorized at this point is that John may not have known exactly what he was looking at. He was just copying the markings that he was being shown. So what he has posited is that what we translate as 666 in Greek, because the Greek for 666 looks very similar to the Bismillah, which means in the name of Allah. It's what ISIS wears on their arms and on their heads. What Chuck missed, right? And so, right. And so if we roughly translate the verse a little bit differently, it would be, he who has wisdom must understand the number of the beast, because it is the number of a man, Muhammad, or it is the multitude of a man, and his multitude is in the name of Allah. Would kind of be how that reads. And that one seems to make sense to me, because that is the sibling rivalry that was prophesied early on in Genesis, that it would exist until the end.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good segue into the Isaac Ishmael, Israel-Palestine situation, kerfuffle that's been going on and is happening now. Before we get to that, though, so just to kind of clarify, you don't have any concerns that the mark is something like the the vaccine or some that kind of thing? Are you just would you entertain it?
No, I don't think the mark will be the vaccine per se, because it does say that it would be on their hands, but also on their foreheads. Now, the interesting thing to note about that is that that's where tefillin and phylacteries go. So when a Jew prays the Shema in the morning, they wrap tefillin and put on their phylacteries. Now, tefillin and phylacteries have little boxes that have little scrolls of a few biblical passages on them. One goes on the forehead, and one is wrapped around the weak hand. Generally, the left hand, because most people are right-handed, but the weak hand would be what it is, and it's to symbolize the commandments, binding your weaknesses, right? So that you don't sin, because that's where sin comes from, is from our weaknesses. Our strengths, obviously, we don't necessarily need help with our strengths. God made us strong in those points on purpose, but we do need help where our weaknesses are. And then the tefillin is to help remember to make the commandments the lens through which you view the world, right? It says they shall be as frontlets for your eyes. So the interesting thing about the mark of the beast being on the hand and the forehead is that it seems to be almost a desecration of that, right? And so I don't necessarily know that I would say, the vaccine would be it, unless if they started doing something with the vaccine that did involve the forehead, I might be a little suspicious.
Well, what about? I mean, first off, I did my bar mitzvah in New York. I on the street in Wall Street. The guy stopped me and he said, "You're Jewish?" And I said, "Yeah, by blood." And he said, "Have you got your bar mitzvah?" And I said, "No." And next thing I know, I was in a camper and they were wrapping me up, and it was just Baruch Atah. It was
That's
amazing.
awesome.
It was the coolest. My wife was there. It was amazing. Except for they didn't let her really be involved in the ceremony, and they were. We can't even really talk to her particularly, and the guy was really apologetic, and he's like, "You just gotta understand it's my tradition." And I said, "I get it. I'll talk to her about it." It was just holding. It leads into another thing that was really cool learning experience going through that. But it was so blessed and so awesome, and I'm so thankful for that moment. But so I've had it on my head and on my hand, and I'd never made that connection. And that is, to me, it was like having Torah on your mind and having it in your action. I felt like it's like being suited up in a VR suit, some sort of superhero, and it felt like an upgrade, right? It was this really intense thing. And so, thinking about it in this term, the idea of it being an mRNA gene modifying pervasive, thing, it doesn't not fit that to me. And I'm trying to be careful with it because the video I made on it has 50,000 views, and I don't want to be flippant with it. And I never said I think it is. I just said, we got to be awake right now.
Right.
The justification that I would have for it being is if you chose to do that, you have a serious loyalty to the current world system. Sure, it could be dangerous. Sure, it could be rewriting your DNA, but you're scared to death of COVID, and you're going to die from it, which means you're watching the media, and you trust the establishment. And to me, there's a level of loyalty involved with making that decision. It could kill me, but I'm more afraid of COVID than this thing I trust. So I've seen the points one way or another. That's why I wanted to get your take on it. I don't know if it is or not, but you'll have to watch my video on Bill Gates and the rider on the white horse. It's wild. It's it could be so accurately, and it could also be something. And I tell people my first rapture, the end of the world experience happened in '93. That's how old I am. And my family, my mom was a fanatic Christian, and we sold everything we had, and we got in a '67 split window Volkswagen bus, and we were driving to the Redwood Forest for Jesus to return. And obviously that didn't happen. And I haven't really done that since. I kind of I'm hey, hopefully, a long time I was hopefully he doesn't return because I'm not ready. Don't come right now because I'm not ready. And so now I'm maybe it is happening, and I don't know. So I wanted to get your take, but only God knows.
Yeah, I tend, on that, I definitely wouldn't rule out the vaccine being the case, just because there are a few other things that definitely fit the bill, and in that, there's talk of not being able to do commerce without it. That's definitely something that's characteristic of the mark of the beast, That's a pretty big one, and it's a pretty close one. So
Yeah.
I'm not ruling it out. It's just I would, for me, would require a little more convincing before I would just hard and fast say that that's it. But yeah, there definitely are. I'll admit there are some similarities. When it comes to the whole rapture thing, though, that's where I do tend to take a bit of a different view. As in, I tend to be somewhere between mid and post trib rapture
100%.
in
I'm
belief.
100%. Like mid I feel like is best case. Post is probably how I interpret it, but I still have a hope. I'd love a pre. That would be amazing. I'm a hopeful pre, and I always kind of make the joke. Maybe it's mid for a pre or mid for most people, and I'm not a good enough Christian, so it's post for me. But whatever. It's God's will, and if He has me here, I'll fight to the end. But yeah, what I love that you said about that, and I honestly didn't expect that response, is you said it's not the mark, which is interesting.
Right. Yeah. No, it's not. It's definitely not something to rule out. I think with the Book of Revelation, like I said, there's just a lot we don't know, and so we can only really guess at it at this point. There are a couple of things that we can know, and that is that God does seem to work on a type of calendar. This is where the holidays become extremely important, actually, because if you accept the virgin birth narratives in both Matthew and Luke, then especially in Luke, what we get is you can surmise that Jesus was most likely born during Sukkot, which would be when the children of Israel are commemorating God dwelling with them in their desert wanderings, right? So it's kind of a perfect time for the Messiah to be born, right? And then him being crucified on Passover. So there are themes to the holidays that we see a level of fulfillment in what has already happened, but then some of them have a waiting fulfillment, particularly like Shavuot, which would be like almost coronation day, as it were, especially in terms of the end times. And so there are some things that, like, I don't know if I would say that on these exact days we can expect the end to be, but definitely kind of surrounding the day. Obviously, no man knows the day or the hour, but the holidays have their themes for a reason, and I think it's something to pay attention to.
Now I'm triggered. Okay, so I made it this far without being triggered. Earlier I said, imagine if when you were going to learn about God, you learned the real info on God, and you had like real schooling about the name and all these. Imagine if this like ingrained genetic, epigenetic desire that human has for tradition, that's in our DNA to follow these traditions. Imagine if instead of the 4th of July and Memorial Day and Easter and Halloween and Christmas, instead of this worldly, nonsensical, pagan, whatever, we were immersed in God's holidays and learning like what had happened and what is going to happen, and that was what was permeating our culture. How beautiful would that be?
Right. We'd be looking at a different world for sure, a different Christianity for sure.
Well, and that's when Jesus was on the earth. Satan was there, and Satan was like, check it out, you can come work for me. I run this show. And people they think that was like an allegory or something. Like, he's running it now, and you can watch how everything he does is against God, is synthesizing or counterfeiting or repurposing God's order. And I just, like, to the Christians watching this now and on replay or whatever, you were lied to about the world system. You were given a pagan, false, Luciferian, basically, upbringing, and I'm sorry, we were all lied to. And let go of pride. Forget. I don't care how many years and how many times you've had it. How much investment you have in it. Stop doing it. Stop doing it to your children. Stop making your children do it.
It's one of those things where this is one of the funniest passages also to try and kind of talk with a lot of Christians about because of how anti-Torah and anti-Judaism they are. But one of the prophets specifically says that, look, there will come a time when the children of the nations come to you and say, please let us go with you, for we have inherited lies from our fathers. Like, well, what do you think that is? What's your answer to that? What are the lies that we learned from our fathers? Tell me.
100%. It's tradition. It's this tradition. I mean, the Bible, and maybe you can clarify this, but my understanding of Jeremiah 10 is don't cut a tree out of the forest and put it in your house and decorate it and do Christmas, basically. Like, don't, like,
Right. That is actually, it's funny. So that's pretty plain, pretty cut and dry, right? Don't cut a tree down, bring it into your house, affix it, and then decorate it with silver and gold. It seems pretty plain, right? And people will argue and be like, no, that's talking about idols. It's like, yes. The Christmas tree is an idol.
Yes.
Like, let's not mince words about that. Back in the times of the Asherah cult, okay? So anytime in the KJV where you read the word groves, right, in the Old Testament, especially in Deuteronomy 12, it says to go and cut down their groves. That word is actually Asherah, because the Asherah cult was a tree cult. Okay, so when we get the idea of groves, now people will try and make the argument that an Asherah pole is not a Christmas tree. It's like, well, no, but it was intended to mimic the idea. And when you go a little farther north into some of the Asherah cults, they do use trees. They do use evergreen trees and whatnot. Rabbi Lawrence Kellerman actually has a great and thorough and extensive talk about the origin of Christmas and the effect that it has had on the Jewish people throughout history and where a lot of these traditions come from. But yeah, I mean, the idea is these pagans, they would bring a tree to a point where they would affix it and they would decorate it and they would then offer it gifts. You know?
It's worse. I mean, I guess I don't want to say, do you know? Do you agree with why a tree, why the shape of a tree and what it's supposed to represent? Do you kind of...
Oh, yeah, it's a phallic symbol for sure.
Phallic symbol.
Yeah.
So now, I'll get real weird here. Sorry, guys. But the maypole and the idea of running, a thing around it is stimulation, right? Is a stimulation thing. So the kids running around doing that, right? So now for Christmas, and this is really base, so God forgive me, but you're going to have your children, wrapping a wreath or whatever that strand is around it, and then you're going to have them get on their knees to receive a gift.
Right. Well, and think about what the tinsel looks like when it's already on the tree, too. It almost looks like the aftermath of...
I didn't even think of that. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, Christmas. Oh, and that's the bad side. Best case scenario, you're turning them into consumers that believe in Santa Claus. Like, sorry, I know enough about numerology that it doesn't matter if it's the word Satan or Santa. As long as it's the same numerical composition, it's going to have the same effect. Basically, the order doesn't particularly matter. And they're believing in this omniscient, omnipresent giver of gifts who's judging you, right? So now your kids believe this nonsense, and then later in life they go, why did you lie to me about Santa? And you tradition. Well, my fathers did, whatever. And then they go, well, how far is it of a reach is it to go from that to they were lying to me about God too? Like, oh, so you're saying my sky man is judging us and he's going to give me if I'm good? Like, it's the same story. And then you're in debt and everybody's stressed out and gaining weight. It's a nightmare. And people are just like, yeah, I'm going to do that. Like, that's...
Right. It's one of those things, man. Like the symbolism surrounding the Christmas tree, it's almost like it doesn't end because it's like you said, the kids, they get on their knees to receive a gift. But think about even before that, because this is why I mentioned how the pagans used to offer these tree gifts, is you have to get on your knees in front of the tree in order to put the gifts underneath the tree, right? You have to bow to that idol before you can get to the phase where the kids are doing it.
Wow.
it almost doesn't stop. And so people can argue about, okay, well, it's the intent. We're doing this for a good reason. It's like, well, Deuteronomy 12 says, do not worship the Lord your God this way.
Yeah.
Don't use pagan methods to worship God. God decides how he wants to be worshipped.
Where in the Bible does it say worship the birth of Jesus? Where does it say that? It doesn't say anything like that. Like, everybody get together and lift up baby Jesus. Like, look, the wise men came, and I understand, like, if you want to do like a reverence in your heart that Yeshua came to the earth, and you want to imagine the birth and like have this moment, then you can just do it without all of the paraphernalia and rigmarole. If that's what your intent is, there's a different way to do it.
Right. And well, it's funny because birthdays are actually kind of that in and of itself is almost a pagan thing. Like, the only time that birthdays are ever mentioned in the Bible, something tragic happens.
Yeah.
So it's accepted that Job, when the house falls on all of his children, that was at a birthday party. Daniel and was it Darius? Was it Darius that that ended up being slaughtered? Like, that happened at a birthday. Like, terrible things happen at birthdays in the Bible. In Judaism, they actually don't make a big deal about birthdays this way because it's kind of a bad thing. The idea is that a pure soul is now being introduced to this fallen world. Like, that's not a good thing that we celebrate, you know? It's like they celebrate more so your death day than your birthday. It's like, yes, death is tragic, but like, you're moving on to better things from that point. Whereas a birth is like, well, no, now there's a pure soul entering this fallen world. Like, that's not a good thing. It is, but it isn't. But yeah, so like, yeah, the idea of birthdays, even in Judaism and in Jewish culture, is just not the big deal that we make of it in the outside world.
Well, so my wife and I, we punted on Christmas, Easter, obviously all of that, and her family is steeped in tradition with holidays, and they're good people, good people. Like, this isn't I know I was fired up about it, but they're well-meaning, and they do every holiday together. And my wife is a fairly new Christian, last 10 or so years, and she's been very receptive to that idea that we didn't want to do it, and now we're both totally on board. We don't do any of the holidays, but we kind of conceded that we would still do the birthday because we wanted our son to have like some experience, right? So we did it, and every year it's like growing a little bit, and my wife's mom is super into it, and we're like, are we going to continue this? Now behaviorally my son expects it, and we're praying about it. We're feeling a little bit convicted. And so when you said that, she said in the chat, she said, "Welp, that's that." So, it's not a surprise. And it's actually really, like, to me, it's really comforting that it's, we're supposed to do it, whatever. But I love that in Judaism that it's not, something that they particularly do. And then one of my other friends in here, a girl that fears God and I have so much respect for, she said, this is really good. She said, and she was into Satanism at one point in demonology. She said, birthdays are considered one of the biggest holy days in the Satanic Bible. It's the worship of self.
Yes. Yeah, that's again, viewing yourself as an individual who's independent of God.
That's it. I'm going to have to collect all my shards of my brain, put them all back in here in my skull. Yeah, and that's it. Like, okay, so what? My people die for lack of wisdom, right? There you go. We're covering it. Like,
right.
Get out of Babylon. Let's get out of Babylon. It's America is. I did a documentary on YouTube about the goddess Columbia and the mystery religion being worshipped here in America, and it's, probably best case scenario, we're a version of Mystery Babylon or Babylon, and so we, there were Jews in Egypt that observed Passover and death. What I love a lot about Passover, but with Passover, it wasn't that if you were Jewish, you were saved. It was if you believed what God said, you were saved. And if you did the thing that he said that you should do, right? So I guarantee you, there were non-Jews in Egypt who were tied into a family, and they were like, we're serious about this. And they're like, all right, we believe you. And their family was saved, and they were like, man, I'm glad I called that guy. Like, they're really excited that they didn't experience that. So, and it's about action. And standard Christianity has been just whitewashed tombs. And this is, look, when I say that, it's not that I'm like a good Christian. I'm a sinner, whatever. I get that. So I'm not trying to come from like an exalted place, but like this idea of go to church on Sunday, do Christmas, be like everybody else. It's just not what we're called to do. And especially this thing that you're talking about with being grafted in and being given an opportunity to we get adopted into this family, and like take it seriously, take that. It's beautiful.
Yeah. It's in terms of like you were saying, the what saved people during Passover was faith, but specifically faith that was embodied by action. And that's the thing, that's where the obedience comes in, is because, like, how do you show that you have faith in the Hebrew God at that point? Like in that scenario, well, you do the thing that God said to do. And that's really where the Torah kind of comes full circle on it. As far as Mystery Babylon, that is one thing where I can say that my confident belief on this is that we are seeing currently the fulfillment of where it says that God says to Mystery Babylon, "Come out of her, my people," because you're seeing all over. And again, I would say that this is a fulfillment of the previous prophecy I mentioned, where there's people going to the Jews saying, "Let us go with you because we've learned and inherited lies from our fathers." So you're seeing people leave Orthodox Christianity and come out of it and into Torah observance and returning to a more Judaic faith, and going to the Jewish people and saying, "Please teach me. I want to learn from you."
I'm watching this, having been immersed in this, content creation, networking thing that I'm seeing, where I'm talking to hundreds, if not thousands of people, and also other creators, some that are on fire and are just doing amazing things. Talking with yourself, I'm seeing it resonated so strong in my heart what you just said, that we're seeing the fulfillment of come out of Babylon. I can't say it better, and there's a bunch of people in my chat that are going to totally agree with this, and we're all feeling it, and we're all getting like similar messages and similar things, similar pieces of information, and it's like, we're done. It's time to get out. Like, potentially Yeshua's imminent, his return is imminent, and I'm so thankful that God is so gentle and gives us so many opportunities, and that he's calling us out. It's beautiful. I thank him.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys want to? Is there anything else? I feel like if we get into evolution, all right, let's do it real quick. All right, so I do this rant sometimes, so I was almost going to spare the people in here, but from what I understand of what Torah says, what Genesis says, it's that basically God created the earth, and actually you could probably correct me on this. I'm going to say what I normally say, and you can tell me I'm wrong, because I'm wrong a lot, but I have always believed that the paradigm that is taught in Genesis is that God makes the earth, he makes the universe around the earth. So the idea is it's not the universe first, then the earth, and that the point of the whole thing is for man. It's for man to have dominion over. So what I believe that Genesis teaches is that he made the earth, then he made the universe around it, and then he made man for the earth. And the point of the earth is for man to have dominion over. And then the theory of evolution, or the Big Bang Theory, scientific materialism, philosophical materialism, teaches that nothing created the universe, and that the universe created the earth, and that the earth created man. And I think that's I don't think you can rectify those two belief systems.
Right. And I would tend to agree with that. The only difference that I, at least my understanding of the Hebrew underlying the text in that narrative, is more so that the universe, earth, everything, all of it came into existence at once, but not in its completed form, not even in its organized form, right? The idea being actually that everything was kind of this big conglomerate ball of chaos, right? That's where, it says that the earth was formless and void. The Hebrew there, tohu vabohu, it indicates in a state of chaos. And so we see there, and it's further indicated by the next verse. It says that God separated the light from darkness. So you get this idea that within this ball of chaos, light and darkness were kind of intermingled with one another. And so they were then separated from one another, and then he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And then from that point forward, the whole rest of creation what you see is he says, let the earth bring forth, let the waters bring forth. So the potential for everything that is in existence is already there. It just has to be brought forth. It's not necessarily created. It's brought forth from the potential of what already existed. Then you get to man, where man is different. God doesn't tell the earth, bring forth humankind. He does tell the earth to bring forth animals and beasts and creeping things and whatnot, but he doesn't say that with respect to mankind. With mankind, he takes and he forms man from the earth himself. So we are actually we are from the substance of creation, but we are a separate creation altogether. And so you definitely you're onto it there with respect to that. The only difference that I would have, and this is where I go a little bit, you and I could probably have a fascinating conversation on this, is that I don't necessarily accept the notion that the garden was on the earth. The way that the passages read in Hebrew, it's almost like the garden was a separate dimension. And in fact, even Judaism today still references it that way. When we see Paul reference the third heaven, that would be Olam Beria, which is where Judaism recognizes heaven is. If you ask Judaism what is heaven, they're going to say the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is in Olam Beria. It's called the world of formation. So Judaism recognizes basically 4 realms with 10 dimensions descending between each of those. So you have the world of emanation, where the God that consumes everything exists. So the idea is like, okay, since God is all consuming and nothing can actually withstand his presence, in order for him to create a creation that could be sustained, he had to create somewhere where he's not, at least not in that fullness, right? So you have the world of emanation where he exists. Below that is that space where he's not, at least not in that fullness. All right, that would be the next world, where the world of formation. This is where the Garden of Eden is. Below that would be the world of creation, where the elements are formed. And then below that, the world of action, where we currently reside. That's why everything in this world has to take a physical form, right? Because we are bound by the rules of the world that we exist in. This is the world of action. Therefore, every concept, no matter how abstract, has to take a physical form in order for it to be manifested.
Okay. Well, I mean, I didn't expect to run into that discussion. that's heavy, and I'm gonna have to chew on it, because I hate to say that I've never even read that part where the garden, or, obviously I'm not steeped in the oral tradition, but that's new news, and I'm not against that idea, and I think that
think about it.
Go ahead.
Just real quick, one of the things that I like to point out, just to illustrate that point, right, is that things in the garden are created out of sequence with chapter 1. Chapter 2 is not in sequence with chapter 1. Yeah. And then the materials used are not even in sequence with chapter 1. In chapter 1, the birds are created from the water. In chapter 2, they're created from the earth. Okay. So it would appear that these are not the same place.
So we talked about that on the live the other day, and the conclusion that I had always thought and confirmed by reading it with fresh eyes was that the first one was like a 50,000 foot view, and then the next one was like a granular view. So it was just, an overview, and then it was, nuts and bolts how he did it. But I mean, it's semantics, and again, that's where I I think that it's fun to have those discussions, in particular philosophically, to really kind of toy with the ideas. And I'm a big adherent to thought experiments and really trying to play something through in your mind to see what makes sense. And so I think that it stands the same way. When I gave you the kind of the chronology, it was more about, the intent of the universe and which begat which, and not necessarily the timeline. And the theory of evolution, I feel like it's the antithesis to the Genesis account, and there's a lot of Christians who, they're gappers, or they're, day age, or, whatever. What is that saying, that each day is a million years, or whatever, that day gap theory, whatever that is. But I feel
right.
Like when you have this idea that, Adam and Eve exist in this one perfectish state, obviously sin came, that's totally different than, through all these deaths and slight modifications, you end up getting man through animal, and that man is actually animal. I think the Bible's very specific. They're two different things. And then, the idea that you couldn't possibly take the timeline of the Bible seriously of evolution, because it would have had to have taken so many hundred, a million of years. And then the idea that survival of the fittest, that you're the most cunning and opportunistic, that you're the one that lives. And then when Yeshua was here, he was talking about he who is least is the greatest, and be meek, and if they want your shirt, give them your pants. And I feel like it's the counter narrative to what Genesis says, to what the intent of this reality is and how we're supposed to be. And I think it's Luciferian. I think it's designed to partially repurpose man and to have people believe scientifically, they're programmed to believe this, that they can't trust the Bible, they can't trust God as creator, they can't trust the timeline and all these different kind of things. And that the what I call the priests of the religion of science, they teach this thing, they indoctrinate the children at a young age, you can't question it. And it's more than frustrating for me. It's like a life's work right now to try to either debunk it or to bring the God's narrative to defend our creator in the information war, because I don't think the science even backs it. So that's where I'm at. And go ahead with your side.
Right. Yeah, no, I would tend to agree with pretty much everything you just said. It's one of the benefits, I think, to being homeschooled. I understand people's objections to homeschooling, but I at the risk of sounding extremely cocky, I see my peers and then I know me. I've been fortunate to have the parents that I did who taught me the way that they did. There was a heavy emphasis on critical thinking and learning to think for myself, which is why debates have been a part of my upbringing. My dad never just, even when teaching theology, my dad never just read the Bible, explained to me what he thought it meant, and was like, yeah, that's just it. No, he encouraged me since as long as I could remember. I can remember being 2 years old, learning to memorize. I've been memorizing scripture since I was 2 years old. That's when my dad started me. It was as soon as I could talk, he was like, all right, we're going to have him memorize the Bible. But I can remember being that old and having him look me in the eye and say, look, just because I tell you that the Bible means something, don't accept it. If you don't agree, come to me and we will discuss it. And so when he went down the path of Torah observance, I fought him tooth and nail the entire way. Wow. I can tell you how many times we stayed up till 3 or 4 in the morning, Bibles open, and we were just yelling at each other, having a theological debate. That was how I came kicking and screaming into this path. And that's why when I get into two debates with people about it, it's like, look, you're not bringing any argument to me that I haven't already heard and made myself. In fact, for most people, it's like, look, I argued this better than you are right now.
I love that. I actually said to my son today, we were talking, he's 6, and, when I do a video about the age of the earth or about, some sort of counter-evolution information idea, he's around. And so I've had to explain to him the idea that, this is what we believe, and we read the scripture, but I'm trying not to indoctrinate him. And I even said something today to him come to me if you don't understand this, or if you want to talk about it, if you disagree with me. Not exactly what your dad said, but something in that same vein. And that's where I think a good parent is going to equip their son, and I don't want to say a bad parent, but putting your kid in school to just go, well, you got to be like everybody else, and it doesn't feel right for me as a parent. My intuition says I shouldn't do this, but I can't be the weird homeschool parent and have weird homeschool kids. And so you just drop them into school. And at that point, it's not about intelligence or equipping the kid. It's about conformity. It's just about making them good employees, getting them to, get used to the 9 to 5, not ask any questions. They're taught a version of history that is very America-centric and a very specific to the kind of industrialized nation. And then, they just don't pay your taxes. Just pay your taxes, be a good citizen. You get your Fridays once a month off and just enjoy your slavery. And so it's not about being intelligent. And I didn't know you were homeschooled, but I can tell you that it's a huge vote for, my wife and I feeling good about what we're doing. She even made a note in here. She said something about how happy she is that we're homeschooling just based on your success. And schooling, it's putting the kid in school isn't about them learning or being wise. It's just about conforming and being, brought up, indoctrinated to believe the godless whatever system that we're in, where people get a vaccine and don't ask any questions, even though it's modifying the DNA and could be the mark of the beast.
Yeah. My dad, my parents, their choice to homeschool me, actually, and all of my brothers. So I'm actually number 2 out of 7. And their choice to homeschool came from a couple of different things, but I will say probably a big part of it, in terms of just being conformity, is that my dad migrated to this country from Cuba. So he knows exactly how the conformist system works. Wow. And he wanted no part of it.
See, and we, God forbid this goes on for another, in the trajectory that it's going, for another 10 years, and then we all migrate out. But we would be your dad going, I watched this happen, and it was just, this, and then I had to watch what I said on YouTube, and then I was getting banned, and then they're forced vaccinations, and we had to bail, and yeah, so that's awesome that it's terrible your dad had to experience that, but that really helped you be who you are, and I see you as an amazing, God-fearing individual who you're doing this. You've got 25,000 followers, and I know that some people are fired up because you have, like you said, you're a debater and you have your stance, but you're urging people to know God and serve God. And I think it's amazing that, I don't think you or I could have imagined doing this 10 years ago. And, here we are, and it's a really awesome thing. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, man. I'm glad your parents did what they did. And, I appreciate you even coming on to talk about it.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate the opportunity. This has been a refreshing conversation, man. I mean, I can't. It's one thing to come up to other Torah practicing people. It's another thing to come up to other people where there's various other levels of agreement. But when you find somebody who's kind of on the up and up on the conspiracy theory, it's like, my guy.
Love it. Well, I'll tell you, I would love to. I don't want to take advantage of your expertise, but like a series, you might have it in your content. For me and my family, we want to serve God, and we're figuring it out. He's being very gentle, like you said, he started with Sabbath. I love that you diagnosed that at the beginning, and we can feel the urging for these other things, and we want to, I want to try to make good on this opportunity he's given us, and I don't want to be super righteous and super religious, but serving God and observing the Torah seems like, man, if you could accomplish that, I don't know. I can't imagine anybody having a problem with it, but some people do. So whatever. Let me go through a couple comments real quick. Do you have any on your end? Anybody have any questions or anything?
Not really. There's kind of been a bit of debate going on between people watching my stream. So there's been people asking questions and then other people answering it, and so I've been watching it like, oh, okay, they got it.
Cool. Yeah, I've had a lot of that too. Well, let's maybe potentially do it again. We'll just message and see if there's some other stuff we'd like to cover, or other info. I don't want to say stuff. And you guys, if you aren't following Brad, please do. I watched about 20 minutes of content today, and just like he did tonight, he's going to open your mind, open your eyes to some things that you probably weren't thinking about. And it's based in Hebrew, it's based in the Torah, and it's based in years of researching this. And he's a guy I'd love for you to follow, because you're gonna appreciate it. He's gonna bless you. So I think
appreciate that. And same thing to all of anybody watching my stream right now. Definitely give Voice of Reason a follow, because if for nothing else, the name Voice of Reason is something we all need today.
Yes. If you want to check out what I do, it's mostly conspiracy, intelligent design. I say philosophy, theology, and conspiracy. I'm not a Bible scholar. I fear God. I'm doing my part there, but I'm trying to reach the people that believe that science taught them that there was no God and want to fight me about it. That's who I'm trying to reach. And so, if you want to check it out, I've got some intelligent design things. I've only been doing this for 2.5 months now, but yeah, I'd love to have you on board.
Absolutely.
Then, yeah, everybody, thank you for being here. Brad, thank you. I'm going to end the transmission, but this has been awesome, brother. Love you.
Love you too, bro.
Yeah.